Welcome everyone, Costin here with my campaign overview guide for Repanse de Lyonesse, or as we don't know her, Jeanne d'Arc of Warhammer Fantasy. What is Repanse? Well, technically, according to Games Workshop, she is a questing knight, but for all practical purposes, she is a Grail Knight. She's using a Grail Knight sword. She had the quest given to her by the lady, and she succeeded in that. So yeah, she is a Grail Knight, effectively, of Bretonnia. And she is quite powerful in battle as a result of that. She's got a great deal of durability. She's kind of like a mini Volkmar in a lot of ways, in that she has a similar ability that Volkmar does have, or Archlectors or Warrior Priests do have. Specifically, the ability is the Halo of Maidenly Wrath. Now, it won't do anywhere near as much damage as the explosion of Archlectors, Volkmar, or Warrior Priest, but it will significantly debuff the enemy that do get hit by this, and will vastly increase their durability as a result of it, because enemy melee attack being reduced by that much means that they'll have a hard time hitting her. Like, you can literally charge Repanse into the middle of an enemy army and they'll just swarm around her and she will survive. In fact, she'll take a lot of them down with her against the full stack before going down. But despite the advantages that Repanse does have, she is a Bretonnian legendary lord. And Bretonnia is an okay faction, but it's certainly not one of the best factions that currently exist. What are the pros? What are the cons? Well, Bretonnia does have a pretty good economy, with the farms in particular being able to generate a substantial amount of money, but so can the industry from the tailors. But although you can generate a good amount of money, you can get a lot of unit recruitment as a result of it. There are limitations when it comes to the faction, largely because of the peasant economy. The way this works is that you have a cap on how many infantry units and artillery units, basically non-cavalry units from the cavalry, you have a cap on how many of them you can recruit before your economy starts suffering, because the more peasants you take from the fields to fight in the army, the less people are there going to be available to work the farms. You can increase this capacity by taking settlements. I believe each settlement that you take gives you 2 when it comes to the peasant economy. There's also ways to increase it, or one major way to increase it, via the water pumps over here in the technology tree, though this is going to take you 30 turns to actually achieve when it comes to research, but it will certainly vastly increase the amount of peasants you have. Early on, however, it means Bretonnia is going to be limited, because if they recruit too many infantry units, too many artillery units, their economy is going to collapse. But if you don't recruit units, you're just going to be overwhelmed by your enemy. So it is going to be a balancing act between the two of them. When it comes to lore choices and hero choices, they do have 2 lore choices. They have the regular Bretonnian lords, who are pretty decent melee combatants, but they also have magic users and the prophetess. Specifically, I would argue that life magic is the best choice that they do have when you are playing as Bretonnia. And each of every single lord, as well as heroes, they can go on a vow. These vows will give you some benefits. For instance, Repanse, since Games Workshop considers her as a questing knight, she starts with 10% campaign movement range, weapon strength, upkeep greatly reduced for questing knights, and at the knight's vow, Knights Errant, Knights of the Realm, Pegasus Knights. And then for the Grail vow, you get the upkeep greatly reduced for Grail Knights, Grail Guardians, Royal Pegasus Knights, and Royal Hippogriff Knights, as well as having the Lord wounded instead of killed. This doesn't matter for Repanse, of course, herself, but it matters for other legendary lords. And then you've got vows for the heroes, which the Grail vow will restore them, will wound them instead of getting them killed, because you don't automatically get Immortal with your heroes or your lords when you are playing as Bretonnia. You need to earn it with the vows. Now, what's great about Repanse is that she is really ideally suited to fulfilling those vows. Because, like, for instance, the questing vow, it's like, oh, win a siege battle in jungle or desert. Guess where you are? You're in the desert. So there's quite a few advantages when it comes to unlocking those vows if you are going to be playing as Repanse. Speaking about Bretonnia further, you do get paladin heroes. You have start with one with Henry, and you can get damsels as magic user heroes. Now let's talk a bit about the cavalry line and about Bretonnia's overall army situation. So their cavalry is really good, but it's cavalry, and it's also really expensive to maintain when we think about upkeep. Like for instance, we have the ability of getting knights errant over here, but without the vow, without getting like the questing vow, then the upkeep on those units will be substantially higher. Like it might say, oh, you can get questing, like these questing knights here with the vow have a 275 upkeep. Without it, they have significantly more. Like we're looking at here 500 just for some basic knights errant if you don't have the vow unlocked for a lord. So it is important to get here lords with vows, but it's also going to limit how many cavalry units you can get across the faction because you're just not going to be able to afford them. By the way, they're expensive regardless, and because they're cavalry units, they might do well in open field battles, they will do exceptionally well in the open desert, but they'll do poorly when it comes to settlement battles and siege battles. Now, since Creative Assembly has changed it with regards to minor settlement battles, you no longer have to worry about as many minor settlement battles, but you still have to worry about sieges. And that is one of the major drawbacks of playing as Bretonnia, because your infantry line is pretty bad. Like, it's got decent shields, like at tier 2 you've got silver shielded units, but when it comes down to their armor, their leadership, it isn't great. This is a lesser version of the Empire. What about archer units, using a bunch of them? Again, they're pretty weak. You can get a lot of them. You can have a full stack of them following your main cavalry army to just deal with sieges. But that's not quite as effective in Warhammer 3 as it was in Warhammer 2. Your most decent infantry options are either the foot squires at tier 4, if you can get them. But even then, they're still a mediocre infantry choice. Or to get the battle pilgrims from the Grail Chapel, but even they aren't too great as units, though they do have frenzy. However, it should be pointed out that you can improve the armor of your units, and I believe the stacks. You can improve for every armor. You can get 2 armor on all units, and armor when defending. But that is a tier 4 structure to really be able to make your infantry somewhat decent. And you're still gonna have plenty of issues when it comes to their leadership as well as their lackluster stats overall. That is the major issue. Like, your main strength is cavalry. Cavalry doesn't work well in siege battles. There's a lot of siege battles in the campaign. That is one of the major issues Bretonnia does face. They do have one very significant advantage, though, when it comes to sieges, in that they can get field trebuchets at tier 2. And one shouldn't underestimate this. This might sound laughable, but outside of the dwarves and Warriors of Chaos getting hell cannons on turn 1, Bretonnia actually has the best early game artillery in the entire freaking game. I mean, mortars from the Vampire Coast are really effective against armies if you can actually shoot them. But when it comes to taking settlements, trebuchets are really good at being able to achieve that purpose. They'll do a lot of damage to walls and wall towers. So you do have a way of taking cities. You knock down the walls with trebuchets. You build a couple of trebuchets at tier 2. You knock down the walls. And once the walls are knocked, you try and find some space for your cavalry to operate. It's best to go with cavalry. It's best to go with questing knights as opposed to Knights of the Realm, because questing knights are going to be more effective in a straight up stand-up fight, whereas Knights of the Realm are more focused on charging. Like, questing knights are better in a stand-up situation, questing knights are better in a stand-up fight, though they do have slightly less armor, but the other stats, like when we're thinking about weapon strength, melee attack, even melee defense, like questing knights are just the much better choice. Now, of course, eventually you would go into Grail Knights, Pegasus Knights, Grail Guardians, rather, which would be a really good unit for that. But keep in mind, cavalry units are still very limited when it comes to sieges. Now, with all that talk about Bretonnia as a faction, I've done a more detailed video on this side. I'll link it at the end of this one. Let's talk about Repanse's situation. Faction-wide benefits, she gets free control in all provinces. So she's never going to have rebellions, period. She also gets a commandment that gives her a ridiculous amount of control. So once you take a province, doesn't matter if it's sack it, loot and occupy it, you're unlikely to face a rebellion, unless you've just looted and occupied like a 4-region province without stopping. And even then, it's very hard for a rebellion to happen. It probably would need to happen in a region with very high levels, or a province with very high level of corruption. You get a minus 50% upkeep for embedded heroes, pretty good. Bretonnian heroes, paladins can be pretty effective. You get 8 melee defense for questing knights, and you suffer diplomatic relations when it comes to the undead factions that do surround you, which is going to be the main issue of your campaign, because you've got Sartosa, you've got Arkan the Black, you've got Cetra, and you've got a bunch of other minor factions as well. You start a war with a minor vampire counts faction. When it comes to her personal skills, she gets 4 chivalry per turn, 5% physical resistance for all peasant units, leadership to peasants, and the AoE ability, the Halo of Maidenly Wrath. From her skills, she gets more casualty replenishment, armor-piercing damage for infantry. She really is benefiting the peasants when you're playing as her. That doesn't mean you should mass peasants. You're probably going to want to have a 50-50 ratio between like peasant archers and cavalry. Like, it's not worth it, even with all the benefits that Repanse gives. Like, the most important thing here, though, is that 5% casualty replenishment that you can get with her. Then you get construction costs, construction time, local recruitment, minus corruption, frenzy for her entire army, vigor reduction for her entire army, the Fleur de Lis, banner, which gives melee defense, melee attack for units within a radius. She is a melee powerhouse, and she can really benefit a lot of your infantry units, cavalry units, and your entire army. Now let's talk about campaign situation. So you start a war with the Strigos Empire. They do have a fairly substantial army here, so you need to be careful. What you want to do here is you want to win this fight with minimal casualties. You can, if you can bait the enemy to surround the Repanse and then just use your field trebuchets to take them out. Once you do that, you have 2 choices. You can either try your luck at taking the capital. Just bear in mind there are 14 garrison units. Even if they're weak units, there's still 14 units, including Black Knights. Whereas this settlement does have 11 units, but they're just zombies and skeletal warriors, with the exception of fell bats and dire wolves. So if you can win this battle with minimal casualties, you can then take the settlement, and then turn 3 take the city. Though, just bear in mind, it isn't necessarily the easiest campaign start. Once you take out the Strigos Empire, the Knights of Origo will offer to confederate with you, and you want to accept this confederation. Like, you want to ideally take this entire province at turn 3, have her in the capital over here in Alhaik. Then you'll get Sir John Terwald, who will have a bunch of infantry units. Like, what he'll provide he'll bring a bunch of men-at-arms with polearms. Still not really good infantry units, but certainly better than many of them, at least in terms of melee ability and anti-larger ability. But crucially, he's going to have a trebuchet in his army, and getting that second trebuchet early on will help you a lot in sieges. So you want to take Alhaik, you want to take this entire province, and you confederate the Knights of Origo. What do you do then? Well, your best bet is actually to go after Baron Tegan and wipe him out. If you don't wipe him out, the dwarves will, and they might just declare war on you as well. In every campaign I've played, the Greybeard Prospectors declare war on Tegan's errantry, or Tegan's errantry declares war on them. Now, if you bring an army of just 19 units with Repanse to do it on turn 4, you might be able to even capture the trebuchet that he does have. Now, technically, you have free knight factions surrounding you, but from a practical standpoint, like, the Knights of the Flame are going to be wiped out turn 1 by Arkan the Black. The Knights of Tegan's errantry is going to be wiped out very quickly by the dwarves, and you're just left with the Knights of Origo, which you can confederate fairly quickly. It is a bit of a shame, because there's actually ways because there's some significant benefits when it comes to diplomacy to actually get a lot of diplomatic relations and confederate these knights. But it is a pointless research because the Knights of Origo will join you very quickly, and the other two will be wiped out very quickly. What do you do once you've taken the settlement? Well, you wait a turn, you end the turn, you wait a turn, you then sell it to the dwarves. Hopefully you get a trade agreement with the dwarves, non-aggression pact, military access. They can be good allies, and you also have a quest to engage in diplomacy with the dwarves for one of the items that you can get. Or rather, for a banner. I mean, she only has one quest item, but she can also get a banner that is pretty useful. Like, if you establish a trade agreement, you get 25% missile strength for one single peasant bowman unit. It's not great, but it's better than nothing. What do you do after? Once you've taken this entire province, you'll have Zandri, you'll have Matrek. What do you do next? Well, you could go directly, you could gather everything you have and go directly against Arkhan. If fighting him on an open field, it will be difficult because Arkhan does tower with an extra army capacity, so he'll be able to throw 2 armies at you. If you wait for it, like within a couple of turns, he'll have 1.5 stacks, maybe even 2 full stacks. And he'll actually have proper units, not just skeletal warriors and skeletal spearmen. I mean, he'll have plenty of those, but he'll also have crypt ghouls, direwolves, felbats. So he's going to throw a lot at you. Though you can win this battle, just be aware it's a bit of a difficult one. Or, alternatively, you could go over here in the Cracked Land and take it over. Fight this Minor Tomb King's faction. The benefit of fighting this Tomb King's faction is the fact that if you do want this province, it's a really good province. But if you wait, if you go after Arkhan first and then go after the Cracked Land, then it's quite likely Volkmar will enter here, and you don't want to necessarily have to fight Volkmar for this province, but you do want this province. It's a pretty useful province. It's got good defenses because of the river here, slowing down any attackers. And like Zandri is the most vulnerable, really. Not the Black Tower of Arkhan. Zandri can be a bit vulnerable, but generally speaking, you will be fairly secure because of the river over here. Once you've taken the Cracked Land, or if you've taken out Arkhan, you want to go for the Great Desert of Araby, and then, like, let's say if you take the Cracked Lands, you want to go to Arkhan's capital, like, bring 2 armies or 1.5 armies, there, declare war on Arkhan. Now, Arkhan is probably going to make for the Kofar port, but even if you lose it, you can always reclaim it, and you should be able to have enough money. Now, let's talk a bit about something when it comes to money. When it comes to Bretonnia gaining post-battle money, like, let me just go over here to this army and just auto-resolve it. You generally will lose chivalry for like ransoming or sacking settlements, but you shouldn't care because you'll be gaining a significant amount of chivalry regardless in your campaign. So just sacking settlements is not necessarily a bad thing. However, if you sack too many if you do sack a lot of settlements, then you'll get a quote-unquote negative trait, which will reduce your chivalry every turn, but also increase the amount of sacking income you get when you do sack a settlement. It's good to get that trait, though you may not want to have it on too many lords because you certainly don't want to end up in a chivalry deficit. That would be a pretty terrible idea. But let's say having a Repanse, having a Tannish second or even third army can be a significant benefit, and you'll certainly earn a lot of chivalry for every single battle. For every settlement that you take, you'll gain a lot of chivalry, though you'll always lose chivalry when you sack a settlement. So once you're, let's say, a dozen turns in or so, what you should have is the Cracked Land, the coast of Araby, the Great Desert. This will give you desert attrition, so you don't have to care about water, and the Land of Assassins. You should also have an alliance with the dwarves. Now, in this situation, you've got some very significant benefits. What you may notice is that a lot of these regions have trading resources. So you've got spices, you've got salt, you've got pottery and Zandri, dyes over here, and dyes over there. And as well as more pottery. So you've got a lot of trade resources. That means you can get a ridiculous amount of trade income if you do establish it. The problem is actually getting trading partners. Like, you might be able to make a deal relatively quickly with Volkmar if he's still alive. Or if you don't end up in a war with him, you can make a deal relatively quickly with Volkmar, start trading. Other options are the border princes, though you may have reasons not to do so. Tylea, again, reasons potentially not to do so. But what you really want to get are trading partners so you can sell your trade goods. Until you have those trading partners, my advice would be demolish this barracks. You're not going to recruit men-at-arms. Don't bother with that. And get fields so you can get archers. Get the archers. That's what you want to do. The Kofar docks give you the ability to recruit knights errant. You have a substantial amount of benefits in the campaign early on because you can recruit cavalry from independent buildings, so you don't have to take building slots to be able to recruit decent cavalry units. But either way, yeah, just get rid of the barracks. And actually, don't bother with barracks until you're like tier 3 in your settlements, because that's when you do, when you may want to bother with barracks, just because, or even tier 4 really. When it comes to your cavalry chain, you may want to get the tier 2 one just to be able to get the paladin heroes. Though bear in mind, you're only going to be able to increase the capacity at tier 3. But by that point, you'll be able to recruit Knights of the Realms and questing knights. You also want to upgrade your farms, but the problem with Bretonnia is you need to get the windmill in order to get tier 2 farms, which gives you peasant bowmen with fire arrows or pox arrows. So either poison or flammable arrows. Alright, what do you do once you've basically taken Araby and the Cracked Lands? Well, you could head over into the desert. Fight Manfred, fight Cetra, fight Volkmar potentially. That is a campaign plan. It would work, but it would be limited because you can't expand into the Badlands. The territory, it's uninhabitable. You also don't want to expand in the jungle. And if you do take off Volkmar, Cetra, and Manfred, you're going to end up in a war with Tic-Tac-Toe. Hell, you might end up in a war with Tic-Tac-Toe regardless, but you will certainly do so if you end up in the land of the dervishes and the shifting sands. So there are certainly significant benefits from taking all of Khemri, but you may just want to delay that in a campaign. Though bear in mind, campaign victory conditions, you do have to deal with Arkhan and the Drakenhof Conclave, though generally Volkmar and Cetra wipe out Manfred. When it comes to long campaign victory condition, by the way, you do want to get the short campaign victory condition quickly because it's hero capacity, and long campaign gives you hero recruit rank, very substantial benefits. Long campaign requires you to complete the final errantry battle, which is something you're going to get at the end of your campaign. At the very, very end of all of it, you'll have a choice of the final errantry battle, which shouldn't be really a difficult one. But one of the better choices, instead of going to war with Manfred, Volkmar, etc., one of the better choices would be to go to war with Sartosa. It's quite likely Sartosa will declare war on you regardless. Like Arkhan may not declare war on you immediately, nor will Sartosa, unless you make diplomatic deals with the people they start at war with, like Tylea. Or, like, Sartosa may also very quickly end up at war with the Western Border Princes, or the Border Princes in general. You wouldn't want to necessarily make deals with the Border Princes because, hell, you might want this entire province for yourself. Or maybe you don't. Because if you do take the Border Princes, you've got this entire territory which is going to be exposed to Scarbrand. And you may not want to deal with Scarbrand, just worth saying that. In fact, one of your best campaign plans, because you're eliminating Arkhan and you're taking the Cracked Lands, one of the things you can certainly do in your campaign is make some deals with Cetra and then head north. Then Cetra will head north, deal with Scarbrand for you. Or maybe he'll deal with Tic-Tac-Toe. Like, just eliminating Arkhan means that Volkmar and Cetra, who generally spend most of their campaigns when Repanse is controlled by the Eye, they spend most of their campaigns just fighting an unending war with Arkhan, which they struggle to defeat. Like, I've seen Arkhan survive hundreds of turns, or well over 100, 200 turns, fighting an unending war against Scarbrand, Cetra, and Volkmar. That should give you an idea of how powerful Arkhan can be. Eliminating Arkhan means that they'll focus on other factions. Hopefully not on you. Hopefully you can avoid a war with Cetra. But if you want to avoid a war with Cetra, you might want to delay taking the Black Pyramid of the Gash, though there are certainly some benefits in doing so quickly. But there's also reasons you might want to wait with that and instead head over to Sartosa. Sartosa can be a strong economic hub. Take over Tylea, go for Skaven Blight, go for Estalia, eliminate Mogur, take out his Hurt Zone, take Estalia, and then start heading into Bretonnia. Though, of course, that's going to put you in contact with the Wood Elves and all the problems they can create, but it's also going to put you in contact with the Fey Enchantress. And you do have research, and you do have ways of improving. Relations with other Bretonnian factions. Just bear that in mind. And you can potentially end up confederating all of Bretonnia. And I believe Bretonnia actually doesn't have any confederation negative, so you could confederate the Fey Enchantress, you can confederate Lu and Leon Kerr. If you show up in Bretonnia and you help the Fey Enchantress against Grom, hell, if you eliminate Skaven Blight, that's a major benefit for the Fey Enchantress, and then if you eliminate Grom, even better, and then you can take all of Bretonnia for yourself, and then you can march into the Empire. Though what you decide to do is really up to you. Just bear in mind that although you can take certain territories, the most substantial territory you can take and hold is the Empire itself, which creates certain issues because you might not want to end up in a war with the Empire. Also, just bear in mind, if you go for Southern Bretonnia, it puts you in contact with Alpha Lorem. Relations with the Wood Elves for every single one of their neighbors can be shaky, with the exception of the Fey Enchantress because of who she is. Anyway, early on, take the Vampire Counts, take the Crackland, into the desert, then Arkan's capital. Or take the coast of Araby, then get the Confederation, take out Matrek, like you should always take out Matrek, then march directly on Arkan, then worry about the desert, then worry about the Crackland. The downside of that is you're going to end up in contact with Volkmar, might go to war against the Tomb Kings over here by the time you've dealt with Arkan. So just bear in mind, there's pros and cons. Like if you go for the Cracklands first, you're giving Arkan more time. If you're going for Arkan first, you're giving Volkmar time to take territory that you do want, and you might end up in a war with him as a result of it. Anyway, Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and I'll see you boys and girls next time.